So I want to take a little time to dive into one of Hippocrates' quotes, "Let food be thy medicine." And in doing so, I want to look back a little bit at the hunter-gatherers, like kind of our ancestors way back, and they were pretty much dependent on wild plants and animals. And basically, they had selective pressures from their environment that basically required them to eat to survive. And as the human species evolved, those nutritional requirements that they had kind of helped shape what our present day requirements are, through evolution. And there was a certain degree of regional variation through these populations, but essentially the diets consisted of high quality animal source protein, and that would be no hormones, no antibiotics, no pesticides, no genetically modified organisms. It essentially was naturally organic, free range meat. And other sources of protein would have been eggs when available, also seafood. They did eat insects. I don't think anybody around here is out searching through their yard looking for insects nowadays, but that's primarily what the diet consisted of. They did have some of the plants and the vegetable matter a little bit later on in the history, but like during the Ice Age and all that stuff, that wasn't available, and that was a large chunk of time. Also, they did have some fruit when it was available, but generally it wasn't like the super sweet fruits. It was more of a tart wild fruit in more limited quantities. Looking into that a little bit further, of all those macronutrients that we need, the proteins, the carbs, the fats, the only ones for which we don't have human dietary requirements for is carbohydrates. So you make the argument that we need glucose. We can break down proteins and get that glucose for our requirements. I'm not saying that everybody should go keto and entirely cut out all carbs, but we don't really need them especially in the quantities that they're getting consumed today. So that kind of brings us to like the state of where a lot of our chronic diseases are today. And if you look at the healthcare system and the state of our nation's health in general isn't ideal. So that carb topic comes into play when you talk about like syndrome X or metabolic syndrome, or essentially insulin resistance. And a lot of the chronic diseases are going to be a result of overconsumption of sugars and carbs, and especially the processed grains and all that stuff. So going back again, so we look at the hunter-gatherer history. Eventually that agricultural revolution occurred. That really wasn't implemented or didn't take place until like a little over 2,000 years ago in Europe. So in the big scheme of like human history, that's not that long ago. But I've heard arguments of, well, we've been eating these foods, from agriculture, the grains, the breads, all that stuff for a long time. And that is a long time, but in the grand scheme of humans, it's not that long. And there's been estimates that it takes roughly 40,000 up to 100,000 years for the human genetic expression to actually adapt significantly. So 2,000 years is nowhere close to that. So the argument there is that we really haven't fully adapted to that agricultural revolution, the grains, all that stuff. And looking back at the average age, way back when, people didn't live as long, but we're living longer, but we're just more unhealthy in those later stages. So if you look at infant mortality, accidents from just like, there was a lot more dangers in the world that we have the comforts of our home, and we don't have quite as many of those dangers. And then infections played a large role. So that really brought that average age of death down quite a bit. However, there is a quote from Eads from 2000 in this article, and it states, "Other methods of determining true probable lifespan, as well as a look at modern hunter-gatherer societies, show it was probably about the same as ours." And they went on to state that, in other words, we're actually comparing, when we compare our average age of death to theirs, is in reality the relative hostility of our two environments, because you have those factors of infections, of the infant mortality and various accidents and that type of thing. So what should we eat? Kind of gave a little bit of a description. There's a lot of information out on the internet, good, bad, and gray areas, and I don't think that there is a ideal diet, one size fits all. Individuals are going to have different variations based on their experiences, their certain situations, and what they've got going on. But I think there is a relative foundation that can be found. And the food pyramid is kind of backwards, and they made some recommendations and updated that a little bit. But you're gonna kind of want your meat and high quality proteins more at the bottom, the fruits and vegetables in the middle, and then or more of the vegetables in the middle, and then the fruits more towards the top. So you're gonna want to get the less sugary ones. One other thing I wanted to touch on was basically the topic of genetics and our genes. And some people say that, we're predetermined or predestined based on what their hand they're dealt is. And that can be a very sensitive subject. Obviously, there are some instances that that was predetermined for them. But if you look at the overall numbers of everything in terms of chronic disease, a lot of those could have been prevented. And I want to kind of look at a couple different numbers here, basically stating that genes aren't that special. Not all of our genes are actively expressed, and actually 99.99% of our genes are formed before, or were formed before the development of agriculture. So those are based on what was before the agricultural revolution for our diet. Then looking at genes itself, so a gene is not going to express itself even at all unless the environment surrounding it becomes favorable to that expression. So essentially what this is called epi-genetics. Okay, and this is a quote by Nora Gedgaudas in Primal Body, Primal Mind book. She states, "Even by the most conservative standards in genetics, we actually control anywhere from a low of 80% to upward of 97% or more of our own genetic expression with respect to potential disease processes and longevity." Basically what that means is we have at least 80% control all the way up to 97%. The genes are turned on or off by regulatory genes, and those regulatory genes, oddly enough, are controlled mainly by nutrients. So it ultimately goes back to eating well and taking care of yourself. Obviously, there's going to be some environmental chemical exposure, different other factors that are going to play a role, sleep, stress, detox, all that stuff in the body. But essentially, there's not going to be a drug anywhere that can regulate our genetic expression better than our diet can. So we have to be conscious of those decisions if that is a priority to us, and really look at what that's going to do to our body.